Hey guys, Mr. Farmer here again. Today we're going over Chapter 12 of AutoCAD. Chapter 12 is all about advanced drawing setup. So our objectives today, number one, know the steps for setting up a drawing. Number two, be able to determine the appropriate limits. Number three, be able to calculate and apply the drawing scale factor, or DSF. Number four, be able to access existing and create new template drawings. Number five, know what setup steps can be considered for creating template drawings. So let's dive right in here. A little bit of this information is kind of a little detailed, so if you need to watch this video more than once, that's totally fine. So what are templates? Templates are what you see here when you go to New. You can see some of the different templates. The one you're probably using a lot is just AutoCAD.dwt. A DWT is a template file as opposed to a DWG, which is a drawing file. There's also AutoCAD ISO, which is the metric version, and then you can browse templates. There's a bunch of different templates in here that you can choose from that are already pre-created. So I could, for example, I could just open up this architectural template. It's already got a layout here. This is an ISO A1 layout, and then my model is already set to the correct limits with all of the line types and everything. So let's see here. So setups, how to set up a drawing, steps for setting up a drawing. There's 10 steps. I'm just going to read them off real quick if you want to write these down. Number one, set your units. Number two, set your limits. Number three, set your snap type. Number four, set your grid, the grid spacing. And then number five is the LT scale and PS LT scale and MS LT scale. That has to do with the weight or the thickness of your lines and the spacing in between your lines. We'll get into that here in just a little bit. Number six, create the desired layers for your drawings. Number seven, create desired text styles if that's needed. Number eight, create the dimensional styles. Same thing if that's needed. Number nine, activate a layout tab and then set it up for the printing device and paper size that you're going to use. And then lastly, number 10, create or insert a title block. A title block is usually at the bottom right-hand corner, and it's where you put all of your information like the drawing name, who did the drawing, the date that it was done, what company it was made for, that sort of thing. So let's just start off here. I'm just gonna click a new AutoCAD drawing, and we're gonna set this up from the beginning. Some of this may be material you've covered before. If so, just bear with me. So remember, step one, set your units. So I can just type in units, right? And just as a refresher, this is your unit type, right? And then your precision level, how many decimal places. You can do this for linear measurements as well as angle measurements. You can also change your units from inches to centimeters, millimeters, miles, whatever you're doing. I'll leave mine as decimal, inches, and 3 decimal places. So that's units. Number two, set your limits. So if I type in limits, this is where you set the limitation of your drawing space, okay? Make sure your bottom left-hand corner always starts at 0, 0. This is like an XY chart where right down here, this is 0, 0. So I want my limits, most of the time, to start at 0, 0. Okay? And then the next piece of information is your upper right-hand corner. So I'll say I want this to be 12 inches by 9 inches, right? And then I'm going to zoom all so I can look at just the size that I need. And then let me show you something real quick. If you go to grid, and then type limits inside your grid, you've got an option. Do you want to display the grid beyond the limits? In other words, do you want the grid to be infinity wide by infinity tall, or do you want it to match your limits? If you switch this to no, check it out. Your grid just matches the size of your workspace. I think that's pretty handy. So now you can really see if I go to limits and set my limits starting at 0, 0, set it to 2217, you can see the size of the limits. And this is an example of where you would want to use zoom all to see your workspace. Right, so there's my workspace right here, just where the grid is. Okay, so set units, set your limits, and then let's talk real quick about the limits. This is where it gets a little detailed. There's some math involved, okay? Using the actual units, appropriate limits should be set in order to draw the object or geometry to the real-world size. We covered that in one of the prior videos. You always want to draw to whatever size the object is in the real world, right? You typically don't want to scale on the computer. Just draw it one-to-one. And then, as we mentioned, use zoom all after you change the limits. It's a good habit to get into. Next, if you're planning to plot the drawing to scale, limits should be set to a proportion of the sheet size you plan to plot on. I know that that's a little complicated. We'll talk about it here in just a second. Setting limits to the paper size allows plotting at one-to-one scale. So here's what that means. If I'm going to print on a sheet of paper, limits, a regular sheet of paper like you would see in a printer, that's typically 8.5 by 11, right? 8.5 wide by 11 tall. So I'm going to make this 8.5 by 11. And there's my piece of printer paper. You can see that kind of looks like the size of a printer paper. And we could prove it out just to make sure. I could draw a square, right? And make that square 8.5 wide by 11 tall, and it matches up, okay? So if I do this, that allows me to plot at one-to-one scale. If I draw a circle here, and it is a 6-inch diameter circle, and then I print it out on printer paper, it is going to print out at a 6-inch diameter circle. It's one-to-one. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. If you plan to plot from a layout, limits in paper space should be set to the actual paper size. However, setting the paper space limits values is automatically done for you when you select a plot device and paper size from your page setup. So what I just did here would be done automatically if we went through the page setup route. Let's talk about drawing scale factor, DSF. Drawing scale factor, the definition is the proportion of the limits to the intended print or plot sheet size. That's the drawing scale factor, right? It's actually just your limits divided by the size of your sheet. DSF is equal to the limits that you put in divided by the sheet size. So for example, let's see here. If I'm going to print on this 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and I draw on this 8.5 by 11 limitation workspace, then my DSF, my scale factor, is 1, like we just mentioned. So what happens if I change my limits to, I don't know, let's see, 17 by 22. 17 by 22. Well, now this is twice as big. My workspace is twice as big. So if I draw that circle again, let's make it a 6-inch diameter circle or a 3-inch radius. I've drawn this 6-inch diameter circle on this 22 by 17 workspace. But when I go to print it out, if I print it on a regular size sheet of paper, or 8.5 by 11, then I'm going to have a DSF that is something other than 1, right? So if my workspace is twice the size of the piece of paper that I'm printing on, then my scale factor is 2. Hopefully that makes sense. If I work on a limit work size of 44 by 34, and then I print on a regular piece of paper, my scale factor is 4. If you need some more clarification on that, let me know. We can work on it in class together. I don't want to spend too much time on it during the video. Okay, the third step, set the snap. So use the snap command or snap grid of the drafting settings dialog box to set the snap type. We've done this a few times now. So when you set your snap, you can set it to whatever you want. Now the goal here, you want to set it to, in order to achieve accuracy, you want the value of the snap to be the smallest dimensional increment that would commonly be used in the drawing. So the smallest building blocks that you would work with, that's what you want to set your snap to. On the other hand, if you set it too small, if you set your snap itty bitty and you've got a big workspace, then it's not going to be very easy to use. You're going to struggle with that. So let's say I set my snap to, I don't know, 1/2 inch, right? And we'll say my grid setting right now is 1 inch. So I should snap, if I've got the line tool, I should snap every half square. See how that works? Every half square it kind of snaps in place. Cool. So the grid. you may have noticed by now that the grid is going to be related to the size of your snap. So if I set my snap to something small, let's say 1/8 of an inch, let's say 0.2 inches, right? That's my snap increment. I can actually set my grid to be a ratio of that. If you say your grid is going to be 5 times 5x, that means that it's going to be 5 snaps through each little square, right? So now that I've set that, I should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So each snap is 0.2 inches, and each grid is 1 inch. And you can set a grid value of 1 times, 2 times, 5 times, whatever works for you, right? Couple of other things I need to mention here. I want to make sure I'm not running long on this video. LT scale. LT scale is a variable that controls the spacing of non-continuous lines, like dashed lines. There's some pretty strict standards. There's an institute called ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, and they've got some strict requirements for how thick the lines are supposed to be and how thick the spacing is in between them. They require that hidden lines be plotted with an 1/8 inch dashes, 0.125. So if you're plotting 1 to 1, the default LT scale value actually plots them at 1/4 inch, right? So you're going to have to use half that scale for your LT scale, okay? Let's see here. If individual lines need to be adjusted for line type scale, you can use properties to do that. Assuming you're planning to create only one viewport in the layout tab, so that here's the layout tab, right? Assuming you're only creating one viewport, set the PS LT scale, that's the paper space line type scale, and MS LT scale to 0, right? This setting of 0 forces the line type scale to appear in the same view layouts as in the model tab, so it just makes it 1 for 1. And you can set those just by typing them in. So LT scale, right? You can change that. Default is 1. And then if we were going to use one layout, we would say PS LT scale is 0. And we can go over that more in class. Just get with me if you've got questions on that. Another thing that has to do with your layers. When you create your layers for these things, make sure you give them a descriptive name. You don't want to name them a bunch of numbers like that because it's impossible to tell what you're doing. So you might say this is part 1A top view, something descriptive on your layouts, okay? Let's see here. Once the layers have been created, assign a color, line type, and line weight to each layer. Colors can be used to give visual relationships to parts of the drawing. Geometry that is intended to be plotted with different pins or printed with different plotted appearances should be drawn in different screen colors. That's just saying if you're going to have a complex drawing, let's say you've got like your house design or something, you want to use different colors for your line types here. So if you've got something detailed, use different colors for your line types. All right, let's move right along. You can create templates. This saves a lot of prep time. If you have a template that you like to use, a certain title block or a certain scale or certain line types, you can create a template. You can save a template off a drawing you've already made, or you can just create one and save it as a .dwt. So instead of going through the steps each time, you can create the template. Let's see here. Template drawing has the initial setup steps, the ones we talked about, units, limits, layers, line types, line weights, so on and so forth. But the template that you create, the .dwt, doesn't have any geometry in it. So it's just a blank sheet. So I could say, I could create a new drawing, and I could set some stuff that I wanted to set. So I'll say limits, let's make it 12 by, see, I messed up, 0, 0, 12 by 9. And then I'm going to change this to only see the limits. So you can see this is our limitation. I'm going to zoom all. It fills up the screen. I'm going to say my snap is an 1/8 inch, 0.125. And I'm going to say my grid is 8 times. So every grid spacing will be 1 inch, right? I've done all of that, and I like it. Notice there's no geometry. I haven't drawn anything. And let's say I've got my layout created, and I'm going to change my LT scale to 1/2, like we talked about, because of ANSI. And I'm going to change my P my PS LT scale to 0, right? So it would be a hassle to have to do that every time I wanted to create a new drawing with these parameters. So what I can do is go up here, File, Save As, and I can save it as a template. Check this out, AutoCAD Drawing Template. And it's actually going to take you directly to the template folder, and I'll call this Farmer's Special Template, right? And I can save that there. Yep, looks good. Okay, so now when I make a new drawing, if I want to have all of those same parameters, guess what I can do? Instead of doing it all again, I can just say Browse Templates, and I can use Farmer's Special Template. That is handy, isn't it? Great. Okay, lots of information covered in this video. I'm coming up on the 15-minute mark, so I don't want to bore you with this. If you have questions, get with me in class. The exercises for this week, for this chapter, you're just creating some setups. You're not actually doing a whole lot of drawing, so take your time on them. If you need help, let me know. Feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks for watching.